So the latest college campus dust-up is at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. There was a walkout there yesterday. We're here. We demand change, says the protesters. They claim injustices on behalf of students of color, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll get more into that in just a minute. But I wanted to step back and take kind of a macro view of this with Gene Policinski. Gene Policinski is with the First Amendment Center in Washington, D.C., joins us on Metro News Talkline, a frequent guest on First Amendment issues. Gene, good to talk to you again. How are you, sir?
Good, Javi. Good to be with you.
Thank you, sir. Gene, I think there's a couple things happening here. I don't want to look at this in a monolithic way. I mean, one is on college campuses, as anywhere, there are legitimate complaints about racism and bigotry, et cetera, et cetera. Then there are, I think, a whole host of sort of frivolous complaints. I feel like something's wrong, therefore I have been wronged, and you got to get the thought police out. And then the third part is there are consistent First Amendment issues here about people trying to tamp down speech that may be unpopular. That's my take on it from a broad view. What's yours?
Well, I think you framed it really well, as you always do. There are legitimate concerns here, and we can't lose sight of that.
Right.
There, racism and gender discrimination and threats and horrible images toward people who are women or minorities or ethnic groups. So I mean, there's that. But I think we can't take a shortcut through the First Amendment to solve some of those problems. I think if you sort of boil away all these things, there's a belief that somehow if you prevent people from speaking about issues, or if you eliminate these sometimes very vulgar and terribly offensive and at times even sense of threatening language, that somehow that will deal with the problem. And really the root cause is much deeper than that. So, I think we just can't give in to a common, if you look through generations, a kind of instinct that says, if we just shut down somebody talking about it, the idea behind it goes away, and to the great sorrow many times of fixing things in our society, that doesn't happen. Ideas don't die just because we suppress one way of speaking about them.
Yeah, ideas die ultimately because they're bad ideas or they're defeated by logic or reason.
That's that marketplace of ideas
right.
that the founders had faith in. They had two kinds of faith. I think they had faith that, first of all, it was better to let us to have more speech than less, and secondly, I think with more speech came better understanding, and that would help solve the problems. The real dilemma there is that it takes time for that. We saw that in the civil rights movement, for example. It took decades to really address that. But John Lewis, the civil rights pioneer, had a great thought. He's mentioned this many times when he's visited the museum here, that without a free press, for example, to really touch the conscience of the nation and the ability to organize and to demonstrate without free speech. With respect to the press, for example, the movement would have been a bird without wings. And I think that says something about the freely expressed, accurate kind of reporting that the press can do, and then the companion to that is the rest of the freedoms of the First Amendment that let us talk about these problems, and as the founders wished that we would.
Gene Policinski is with us from the First Amendment Center at the Museum in Washington, D.C., and the thing's kind of resolved itself, but the whole incident that everybody's seen of the photographer trying to get access to the quote-unquote safe area at the University of Missouri campus, and the professor of communications, not journalism, but communications, so let's get some muscle over here and run this guy out. Now, she resigned, and she resigned and apologized to the guy, kind of a half-hearted apology. Like I said, I used the wrong strategy. But this is in a public area, and a guy doing his job, and then you have somebody in the communications department trying to shut the guy down. It was absurd.
I did a column today about this, and I said there was more irony in that moment than in about a week of daily shows.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, you have a professor of communication, silence communication. You have somebody who has a courtesy appointment in the School of Journalism throwing a journalist out of an area. You're in public spaces with people saying not only, get the photographer out of here, but other incidents on that same video where people were saying, you need our permission to take our picture. And it points out something you and I have talked a lot about, is just the nation doesn't really study First Amendment freedoms because we assume they'll be there. But in these kind of crises, we're really ill-prepared to say, what are our rights, what are the rights of others? That photographer was phenomenal.
Yeah, he was.
Photographer
He really was.
who kept saying the same First Amendment that gives you the right to be here also gives me the right to be here. And he did it in such a calm way after being, frankly, pretty provoked. That I thought it spoke well about the training he got and his attitude and really his approach to of being a member of a free press.
Yeah, I thought he showed remarkable restraint, continued to try to do his job. Meanwhile, people start pushing him back, and they're saying really childish things like, "Well, I can't help it if I'm being pushed," or "I'm just walking up against it." I thought, it was sad. It was sad because it shows, and not that anybody has to be a scholar of the Constitution, but you would think at the college level somebody would have a fundamental understanding of the rights guaranteed by the First Amendment. So, but
today colleges should be the place that push back against an increasingly polarized life and the ability of all of us to live in, the sort of, I think somebody's called them thought bubbles on the internet, where we only look at the apps and the websites and Twitter feeds of people who we agree with us, and it sort of reinforces our own views. Universities should be at the forefront of saying, you're going to come here and hear things that you haven't heard or that might offend you. Obviously they can't rise to the threat of a level of a physical threat, but you may be uncomfortable. And that's part of, again, what I've often quoted, an opinion by Justice Jackson in the 40s, which I call the contrarian theory of the First Amendment. Sometimes you need to hear stuff that makes you mad, if only to be motivated and better prepared to argue against it.
Right.
And therein, the solution to speech you don't like is more speech and not less.
Yeah, Gene Policinski is with us with the First Amendment Center at Museum. And what worries me is about all this is that we have that this is happening on college campuses. This is, as you said, this is happening at places which we traditionally think go to college and hear all the different ideas and sort through them. And now you're seeing this movement to really limit, not just limit speech, but limit ideas, and this whole philosophy that if somebody is offended or it makes somebody feel a certain way, not critical thinking, but it makes somebody feel a certain way. It could be a microaggression and needs to be shut down. Now you're talking about a danger zone, I think.
I think you are, and again, when we talk about violence against women, when we talk about racism and bigotry, those are serious issues, and there are groups in our society that have been targeted, that may still be being targeted. Certainly, make a good case for still being targeted, but let's deal with those issues and not in a way that stops people from exchanging ideas in an open fashion, from having discussions without the fear that they might use a word or a phrase that produces a trigger kind of reaction suddenly and becomes the focal point of the discussion instead of the original problem. I think that one thing that we ought not to dismiss these things. It's just simply as out of hand, as you said at the opening, because there are issues here. And for example, when those people said we need a safe space from the media, and that we can't trust the media to give an accurate accounting, in effect. So we need a safe space away from you. My instincts first were to say, "Oh, come on," and then I thought, "Well, wait a minute, though." I remember a time when civil rights marchers were called every name but adjective, but civil rights workers, and they were done that in a great many papers. So there's a point for self-reflection too. I don't think we should just cave in. Yeah. But let's take a little self-reflection as media and say, wait a minute, why wouldn't people trust us? And, are we spending too much time on the Kardashians and not enough time on racism? Okay, maybe that's a legitimate criticism. Frankly, that's one I've already made. But, let's take it for what it's worth. But I think that, again, as you said so well in the opening, the point of this is really defending free speech and the right of all of us to communicate and not do so with intimidation.
But Gene, what you just said about the media looking at itself in all this is really important too, because that defines critical thinking. Well, wait a minute. Okay, they say this, so let's look at this and see if there's any truth to this. And that's what critical thinking is all about. Instead of, well, that makes me mad, therefore I'm going to do this.
Exactly, and I think again, to go back to the 50s, which I looked at this and I thought how ironic that civil rights workers would invite the media in, and here we have people protesting over a lot of the same general issues who want the media out, or at least in isolated circumstances they want the media out. And I said, well, somebody in the 50s had to look at the news coverage and say, we haven't been doing this fairly, and then they pivoted, and it became a major help to the country to get the accurate picture of racism and bigotry, and excesses at times, frankly, as well. But we got a truer picture, and so let's not ignore what people are saying here. But I think the idea of shouting to silence somebody, you're using the very First Amendment freedoms that you have to silence somebody else. That's not the way the First Amendment works.
Got it. Gene Policinski with the First Amendment Center at the Museum in Washington, D.C. Gene, always a pleasure. Appreciate your insights.
Thanks, Hoppy. Great to talk to you.
Thank you, sir.